Hey guys, welcome back to the One Room Schoolhouse. We are here at Wobblers, joined this week by a special guest, Lieutenant Colonel Braun, retired, also a Texas State Senator who happens to know a little bit about the military. And this week we're going to look at some early military battles, specifically where God's providence was revealed. And it became apparent that here in America, it was more than just the Americans or the Patriots versus the British, because God intervened in several significant ways.
And let's define providence for a minute, because this is not a term we use a whole lot today. When you look at modern Bibles, I think King James mentions the word providence one time. Well, the Pilgrim's Geneva Bible mentioned the word providence 144 times. So previous generations, when they talked about providence, it was talking about God, but they would talk about His providential care. And His providential care was where God intervened. So you can see the fingerprints of God if you look for it. God, because He loves us, wants things to work out a certain way, will intervene and get involved in it.
And also you have a lot of ministers from early America, the George Whitefield, the Jonathan Edwards, the kind of guys who were really leaders in culture, also spoke a lot about providence in their sermons. So this is something that very much was a common vernacular at that time. And actually we're going to go to some early writings where military leaders, even presidents, talk about God's providence in the war in the military. But let's back up. As war kicks off, we know you have Lexington, you have Concord, you have the Battle of Bunker Hill. It kind of unfolds as the military assembled. George Washington is finally chosen to be the president. Starting off is not looking real good for the American military, vastly outnumbered. But one of the cool stories at the beginning is the Battle of Long Island.
Battle of Long Island happened, it was kind of like they call it the New York campaign. So you had Long Island, you had Harlem Heights, you had all sorts of things in that battle. And this is where Washington has now been in charge just for a little bit of time. It's back in June, it's the summer of '75. The Continental Congress says, let's make George in charge of all the military. And at that point, we were in the Boston campaign. So we'd had Bunker Hill and Lexington and Concord. Now you've got a guy to come in, kind of organize all the military, get the other states involved, and that's George Washington. So in the latter part of the Boston campaign is where George Washington takes a young Henry Knox and says, hey, go to Ticonderoga, get some cannons, bring them back. We need cannons. They get them on Dorchester Heights, and that's where the British leave Boston, is when George Washington does that. So he's now in charge of the military, and here we are. On the 4th of July is when the Declaration of Independence was approved. 1 month later, and actually 4.5 weeks later, in August of 1776, they're in New York, and they are losing battles in New York. And so Washington is literally running from the British, and when they get to the Battle of Long Island, you have 30,000 British troops surrounding 8,000 American troops. Now here's the deal.
That seems even.
Well, today, if it was 8,000 SEALs versus 30,000 anybody else, it's an unfair battle. We're going to win that one.
Yeah, 8,000 SEAls will take on anybody in the world.
Anybody in the world.
And
why is it always
I was
SEALs?
gonna
Why
say-
can't there be some Green Berets in there?
I was going to say, the Army guy's going to be upset that we're not talking about the Rangers or the Berets or somebody.
Yep. So all right, 8,000 special forces guys.
Okay.
They would take, but see, here's the deal. Back then, everybody on both sides has a single shot musket, just like this. And it doesn't matter if you're a Green Beret, a Ranger, it doesn't matter if you're an Army SEAL, it's still going to take you 15 to 20 seconds to reload
What if
this.
you were a Navy SEAL, not an Army SEAL? Could you
Army
be
SEAL.
a Navy SEAL?
Well, I'm placating
Deferring to the Army, okay.
So Special Forces, it's still going to take you 15, 20 seconds. So when you have 30,000 of these pointing at 8,000 of these, you're in serious trouble. And it doesn't matter how good your soldiers are, because this is what you're fighting with. And so this is what Washington was facing. So it looks like 4 weeks into this thing that the entire American army is going to be wiped out. There's going to be no America. 4 weeks after we declare independence, the army is gone. And that's what it appears we're facing at that point.
Yeah, so you have more than 30,000 British that have surrounded the roughly 8,000 Americans, that surrounded, being relative, kind of semicircle, because they back them up to the edge of the island. The water's behind them. They can't get away. They can't escape. And then something really weird happens. The leader of the British calls a timeout, and they just chill for a couple of days. They decide not to advance because they have them trapped. They're not going anywhere. Let's just have a good time.
I mean, when you get the enemy on the ground, do you back off?
No. I mean, it's what's called pursuit and exploitation operations is what the British failed to do. What Washington's trying to do is what we call force preservation. Some call it a retreat, some call it retrograde is what we call it, but In some respects, in a more modern light, it's what happened at Dunkirk. You have an operational pause from the Nazis, and it allows the British preservation of their force of 100 and something thousand men that will eventually be back in the fight a year or two later, 3, 4, preserve that force. And that's what's happening here is, the commander's got to choose where he wants to fight. You've got to choose that, it's what made Gettysburg so favorable to the Union, because the Union chose where they were going to fight, not the Confederacy. Washington's trying to make sure he's choosing the right place, but his first and foremost duty is to preserve his force. Better to fight another day.
Which is one of the amazing things, because the British commander had him. He could have crushed them right there, had them surrounded, and he just, as you said, takes a time out. And so for 2 days, he said, we'll chill. He can't go anywhere. I mean, you don't do that.
In my view, part of that is that there's an arrogance of we're the world's most dominant power, and this is a bunch of farmers. The other thing, you mentioned rifles here too, but what the British had a distinct advantage in was artillery. And remember, artillery in the Revolutionary War is a direct fire weapon system, not an indirect fire weapon system. It wouldn't become an indirect weapon system till after the Spanish-American War. So
Define that. Define that.
Direct fire weapons mean you can see the target that you're shooting at. Indirect means that you cannot see. So as an artilleryman, you got a forward observer so the weapon system is shooting at a distance that it cannot see the target that it's shooting at. Somebody else is observing the target for it. So in the artillery community, we call it the AT&T weapon system, to reach out and touch somebody. I hope you don't mind the military humor. But artillery did far more damage as a direct fire weapon system than musketry did as a direct fire
And the
weapon.
British had that, and the Americans didn't.
British had
that. Your comparison to Dunkirk, I think, is really interesting in this case, because that's kind of what happens. Because, right, Tim, as you mentioned, the British get them pushed up against the water, so Washington has nowhere to go except by going to the water. So he sends out an order. They collect basically all the little ships, the barges,
anything that'll float,
anything that floats, loads up the American troops and says, we're going to get out of here. And we actually have right here an account from...
Now, before you do that, interesting thing is he loads up the troops, but the British, one of the things the British are doing, they're sailing their Navy up the East River, because you now have the General Howe, who's got Washington surrounded, and they're going to come up the river behind him with the Navy, and he's got nowhere to go. And so as Washington is saying, get me all the ships, strange thing happens. A storm comes that won't let Washington take those ships off, but that storm keeps the Navy from coming up. He didn't know the Navy was coming up behind him. The storm came out of nowhere. It blew the wrong direction for Washington to cross, but it blew the right direction for the ships not to make it up the river. And then that night, after it gets really dark, the wind stops and turns the other direction, starts blowing across the river, so that Washington starts loading the boats, and so the Navy can't come anymore to block him off, and now Washington didn't know that, but now Washington's able to send his guys across with the boats during the night. So this weather thing happened in a really weird way, a providential way, literally, to change the outcome of what happened.
So all through the night, Washington and the Americans are bit by bit going across the river, getting to safety. But there's, like y'all said, about 8,000 American forces. They're not able to get all of the troops across the river by the time that the sun comes up. Now, at this point, the British haven't identified what's happening, because I'm sure if they had realized that all the Americans are retreating and escaping, they would have, picked up operations again. But they don't get an idea that's happening. But if the sun's coming up, all of a sudden they're going to see Washington and the Americans escaping. And then another kind of very interesting, we would say providential occurrence happens in relation to the weather. And we actually have the account from one of the gentlemen who was there, is Colonel Talmadge, and he records...
By the way, Colonel Talmadge is the guy who's in charge of all of Washington's spy network. He's the intelligence officer for Washington, and he's the guy in charge of finding all the British movements and what they're doing.
So he would know, and he records that at this time, a very dense fog began to rise, and it seemed to settle in a peculiar manner over both encampments. I recollect this peculiar providential occurrence perfectly well, and so very dense was the atmosphere I could scarcely discern a man at 6 yards distance. So right at this moment where suddenly the British would be able to foil the American retreat, a fog comes in that you can't see hardly anybody and allows the Americans to get the rest of their troops to safety, preserving Washington's entire army.
It reminds me a little bit of the story of Moses leading the Israelites from Pharaoh, right, where they get to the Red Sea and they're like, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? And all of a sudden, right, descends from heaven this barrier to separate. They're able to cross the water. I mean, it's really this kind of interesting thought that you see a parallel there. But not only was this wind that kept the British Navy from coming up, and then eventually it changed and let Washington and his little boats get across this mile water, and then a fog comes and settles. There's another providential moment that happens because there was a Loyalist family who saw the commotion.
A Loyalist means they're for the British. They're Americans, but they want the British to win. They don't want the Patriots to win. So that's a Loyalist.
So there's a Loyalist family who hears the commotion. The lady of the house sees that Washington's men are gathering boats, and she realizes they're going to escape. So she sends a servant, quick, go to the British lines, get there, let them know what's happening. We've got to defeat these patriots, right? These colonists. So the servant runs from the house, makes it through the American lines, American camps, and gets toward the British lines. But when they got toward the British lines, this servant encountered one of the British allies, the Hessians. The Hessians were German hired mercenaries, and apparently they didn't speak English because a servant got there and they captured and arrested the servant, didn't know what the servant was saying. The next morning, a British officer comes and the Hessians inform them that they've captured a prisoner, and the prisoner happens to be this servant speaking English, and you can imagine probably the exasperation from this servant going, "What are you guys doing? I've been telling you all night. They're trying to escape." So the British officer realizes in this panic moment, sends out word, so the British then charge the American camp where they were previously and get there in time to discover the Americans are all gone. Also about this time, the fog begins to lift, and they're able to look across as the final boats have reached across the water to the other side, now completely out of harm's way and danger. And this is where we talk about providence on so many levels, because the wind blowing one direction, then the other, then you have the fog coming down. The one person who could have foiled this whole thing, the spy, right, or this servant going to let the British know what's happening, is captured by the Germans who didn't speak English, keep him in jail all night. I mean, just crazy moments. And had the British been able to advance, Washington largely would have been, likely, probably would have been defeated. And logically, that probably would have been the end of the American Revolution and the end of America possibly as an independent nation, certainly as the one we know. This is where, looking through history, it really is amazing to see some of those providential moments where you know that God definitely was involved in the situation.
Yeah, it's one of the things where it's almost inexplicable. Benjamin Franklin, when he talked to the Constitutional Convention, said, not even a sparrow falls to the ground without his notice, which is a Bible verse. And it literally, that's what was happening here. God had plans for America, and they were about to be thwarted, so God had to intervene to help get what he wanted.
So, Lieutenant Colonel, I got to know, if you were the officer who shows up and your allies have captured this guy who's bringing you word that your enemy is escaping, as an officer, what are you thinking and how do you handle that situation?
Well, having been in what's called a coalition, but this is why you have liaison officers that can speak the language of coalition forces, and that's not what the British had here. When you find out what's going on, because you're having to confirm or deny, and the thing that makes a true understanding of what's happened here so difficult is in our modern communications by radio, cell phones. But the level of rigor, the time it takes. In modern warfare, there are no seasons to battle. The whole reason Washington had to go to Valley Forge is because during the Napoleonic Wars, and the Revolutionary War is in the spirit of the Napoleonic Wars, you fought during seasons because the time it took to coordinate, move, everything is done without the industrial revolution machinery. And so I got to get here, I got to get that. Washington's got all the boats that would be used to move people, so now The Navy's got to, instead of being used to as a combat arm, it's going to be used as a transportation arm for all the guys that are sitting on Long Island. That's not where the war is anymore, and so there's an exasperation because the rigor, the lack of speed, the rigor and the laborious nature of warfare of the 1700s. I'm not saying it's not laborious now, but it is terribly laborious in the 1800s.
Okay, so for us, as we study American history, we definitely see moments where we go, that doesn't make any sense that this situation happened or didn't happen in some cases, except for the providence of God. Yeah. As a military guy, do you look in, because obviously you're a Christian too, you're a spiritual guy, do you look and see those moments too where you're like, yeah, God definitely was doing something there?
Absolutely. Yes, sir, because look, the nature of the leaders that God's chosen, Washington would become our president not just because he was a military hero, but remember, Scripture tells us that the Lord chooses our leaders. We may not like at times who the Lord has chosen, but the Lord is the one that puts governments and powers in place. We see that in other places throughout history as well. So having that opportunity, the weather played a huge role here. The relief of Bastogne. Patton's chaplain, praying for good weather.
General James ONeill, his chaplain,
for air cover, because the Luftwaffe is non-existent at this point during World War II. But in a ground fight, we just talked about it a moment ago. I'm not interested in a fair fight. I'm interested in beating on you till I hear you say the words "I quit." And having that ability to do so here. The British were prepared to finish, couldn't, and maneuver is one of the tenets of offensive warfare. Freedom of maneuver is absolutely essential. Napoleon said, "He who fights from his fortress loses," and that's why Washington's moving as much as he is.
Okay, so we're going to spend a little more time this week looking at a few more stories. And actually, we have a new book hopefully coming out here in just a couple months called The American Story, where we highlight many of these stories from the American Revolution and God's providence in keeping America alive. And this week, as we also are honoring military, we had Memorial Day on Monday, and we're so grateful for the men and women who have served this nation, but also those who laid down their lives to help keep us free, to help America be the great nation she is. But this week, as we look at military victories, we're also going to look at God's providence throughout military history and what God has done. So make sure you join us on Friday.
What we try to do with Wall Builders Collection is present America's forgotten history and heroes. He is one of the original black congressmen. This is Hiram Rhodes Revels right there. He's the first black U.S. Senator. Hiram Rhodes Revels was a gospel minister. He was with the black denomination, AME denomination. He was also with the Methodist Episcopal denomination. He also raised 2 regiments of black soldiers in the Civil War, 1 regiment out of Missouri, 1 regiment out of Maryland. But he became a U.S. Senator in an interesting manner. This man is named John Roy Lynch. He's one of the early black congressmen that served. He also was in the Mississippi legislature. He also was a Republican. And he said what made Hiram Rhodes Revel a U.S. Senator, our first U.S. Senator, was that he was asked to open the Mississippi legislature with prayer. He did. And he said the prayer was so good that they elected him to the U.S. Senate. I wonder what the Senate would look like today if we chose our U.S. Senators based on how they prayed.
We've not been before. Man, we are blown away. Tour last night changed my life. It's changed my prayer life. I can tell you I'm going to be praying different.
The history that we have learned that our children and ourselves have been deprived of for so many years. It is so important that our country knows the history that we have, and the Christian perspective of that history has been paramount. We have learned so much.
to hear the heart of America and God and our senators and congressmen. Very, very moving. I would say to all the pastors in my town, do this before you do anything else.
So the pastor's briefing is a transformational event. It will give you hope. Nothing on TV you see like this will ever give you this kind of hope. It will cause you to have a different view of what's going on around you and what God's doing in the country. So if you're a pastor, we encourage you to come be here. It is a life-changing event.
And if you're not a pastor, we encourage you to invite your pastor. Because as you've seen, this really is something incredibly impactful, incredibly transformative, and we want to get as many pastors there. So if you're not a pastor, invite your pastor to come and be a part. You can find out more information on wobblers.com. Go to our website, all kinds of information about this pastor's briefing. But we invite you to come and be a part. If you're a pastor, we want to see you there. If you're not a pastor, invite your pastor. We want to help you make a difference. One of our favorite things about living out in the country is the ability to look up at night and see the stars. It always bothers me when I'm in the city and you look up and like, nope, that's just a street lamp. That's not the stars. If you haven't spent time hiking, camping, go outside and just look up at the stars. It's amazing. But the reason I even bring that up is because one of the things that's so cool is when you talk to an astronaut and you hear about their spacewalks or their journeys or even the moonwalkers, what we did having a space program really was absolutely incredible.
And we seem to be captivated with space, and that's why Vice President Pence and President Trump have said, hey, we've been to the moon, now let's go to Mars. So we've got these new missions going out there. We're always on the frontier of space, but it's fun to see those guys who actually were in space. And there were a number of the guys in the Apollo missions. The Apollo missions are what led to walking on the moon, and 6 missions actually walked on the moon. There were 12 moonwalkers. And you look at their stories, and so many of them say, when I got out there beyond the atmosphere and was out where I could see everything clearly, it had a spiritual impact on me. And several of them talk about how that it really turned them toward a God consciousness and thinking about God. And one of those guys was Charlie Duke. Charlie Duke was on Apollo 16. He's the youngest moonwalker. Charlie Duke was number 10 out of the 12. And this is a letter that Charlie Duke wrote. This is what Charlie said. I'm just reading from the letter. He said, I thought Apollo 16 would be my crowning glory, but the crown that Jesus gives will not tarnish or fade away. This crown will last throughout all eternity. Not everyone has the opportunity to walk on the moon, but everybody has the opportunity to walk with the sun. It costs billions of dollars to send us to the moon, but walking with Jesus is free. It's the gift of God.
It really is one of the cool things about so many of the astronauts, and you can imagine, right? If you're somewhere where you're beyond what man has made, and you're out where this is literally in the middle of what God has made, it would give you a different perspective, which is why we highly encourage, if you live in the city, take some time, go on a hike, go camping, go out in the outdoors so you can look up, and just like the Bible talks about, when you look up, you too can see the glory of God.
Hi, I'm David Barton.
And I'm Tim Barton, and we want to invite you to our yearly Family Legislators Conference held in Dallas, Texas.
We have legislators that come together from across all 50 states to Dallas, and we look at usually about a dozen issues that are hot issues for that year. We bring in national experts, provide great expertise on the things that you'll need to know when you get back to face that issue in your session.
We encourage you to click on the link to find more information about our Family Legislators Conference, as well as once you're there, you've seen this is a great deal. We encourage you to register, and we look forward to seeing you in Dallas in November. There's a lot of people we try to tell the story of here at Wall Builders. One of the individuals that we're going to highlight for you is someone who we celebrate as an American, but he didn't start off as an American, but he did become famous enough they made a movie about him. His name is Wernher von Braun.
Can you believe it? Can you realize that that you and I, that all of us, have actually begun the exploration of another world? We have taken the first historic step into our solar system.
Wernher von Braun was born in Germany in 1912. He grew up in Germany. He had, because of his family, his mother was really interested in science and astronomy. He grew up with a love for space and love for stars and a love for science. And so when he went to college, he was a major in physics and really focused on that.
Got a PhD in physics.
Got a PhD in
which
physics.
I feel like is not an easy thing to do, so probably you're really good at math. And because he's good at math, as he's growing up, when he's in his 20s, he joins and he becomes part of the Nazi campaign.
As Hitler comes to power and he starts seeing what's happening with Hitler, and by the way, because of his physics, they put him in charge of the V-2 rocket program. Now, this is the first in the world. We're now talking rockets at a time you never had it. I mean, we're hardly having cars at the time he's born, and now here he is in charge of a rocket program, so a lot of growth of science, and so he's in charge of it. Well, Hitler starts taking and using that rocket to kill people. He hits London with it, and what he's doing with the Holocaust, and this is not good. And so Wernher von Braun, even though he's a Nazi, he starts criticizing Hitler, criticizing what's happening. Well, the Germans come and arrest him and they throw him in prison, but oh my gosh, they can't leave him there because he's in charge of the rocketry program. So they get him out of prison, he's back with it, but he has this moral dilemma. This is a lot of power. I mean, I created rockets, but it was not for killing people. And so now we have this power in our hands. This is not right, and the Germans aren't the people to have this.
Right.
So he says this needs to go to a nation that is guided by the Bible. That was America. So he defected to America. Now, when he defected to America, the U.S. Army immediately put him in charge of the American rocketry program because we were so far behind.
Yeah, the rockets, what was happening in Germany was advanced beyond anything any other nation had. And so when he got to America, this was a game changer for us. Now, largely the war was already coming to an end. And so it really, you didn't see it manifested the same way throughout World War II. Nonetheless, his technology elevated America so quickly beyond where we were.
And in 1960, what he's going to become famous for hadn't even happened yet. He's the guy who helped put a man on the moon, but in 1960, nobody had been into space yet. But what he had done, even with, this is the U.S. rocketry program, what he had done there was so amazing that they made this movie about Wernher von Braun.
The way I tell it to you, that's different.
Don't go on.
Well, I believe that a big part of the future of mankind will take place in what we now call space. Lord knows I'm a practical scientist, not a poet. But I just can't see space as a vast, inhospitable waste.
Now, he was a strong Christian guy. When he got to the United States, they put him out in western Texas, El Paso, that's where the rocketry program was, and he attended a church out there and he gave his life to the Lord. So here's a guy who literally already recognized this needs to go to a Bible country, that's America, but he's not a Christian yet, but he becomes a Christian in El Paso.
Yeah, there's a little pamphlet that actually talks about his faith that we have. And in this, one of the quotes he has is really interesting related to science. He said, "God has built man with curiosity. God expects man to use this gift. I do not think the process should ever stop. Now we have the tools available to explore space. I believe this. If it were not the Creator's intent for us to explore celestial bodies, He would not have permitted us to have acquired the tools. Something else is apparent. God has not placed any visible obstacles in our way. I believe we have His permission and His blessing." What's awesome about this, the guy who's leading the space program in America defects from Germany looking for a nation influenced and guided by the Bible. He himself is guided by the Bible in his life and what he does. That we know in the race for space. In 61, when the Soviets get a man in space and the Americans get a man in space, but America gets to the moon first. All of this happens largely because of von Braun and his involvement. Actually, one of the other things we have is a record, and records, there were kind of records around when I grew up. It's a little before my time. I'm pretty sure I know how it still works.
So this audio record is what happened around the landing of Apollo 11 when man first went to the moon with Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin and others. And so what happens is throughout that entire process of the several days of going to the moon, he's talking with a national correspondent, Chet Huntley. And they have their conversations. He says, here's what's about to happen, here's what just happened, here's what Neil just did. And he goes through
So the guy in charge of the program is walking you through the process. And so ultimately leading up to this is one small step for a man, right? The famous words we kind of know, but this is an audio recording, so we have an original record, which is super fun, actually still sealed up. I think you can find this audio on the internet. You can go and listen to it. The point is, von Braun is a famous name in American history, but the story of him getting here is a very unique story. And even when he gets here, how God gets a hold of his life, and then the entire space program, his entire life is shaped by faith. one of the things that today we seldom recognize how much faith played a part in so many of the heroes of our nation. Hey guys at Wobblers, we have a new product line of t-shirts, actually a few different kinds. So on the one Jonathan's sporting, it's actually a Frocket front pocket. On the back, it has Washington crossing the Delaware. It says the original surprise party because, hey, on Christmas back then, we actually surprised the Hessians. Hey, we're here, and we won. Also, we have a Squad Goals t-shirt, which is names of founding fathers. We also have a couple other Wall Builders t-shirts, and actually on the gray one, on the back, it has the Bible verse upon which Wall Builders is based, so you can find out more about that. If you want to have a Wall Builders t-shirt, if you want to support that, or just have a fun t-shirt, go to wallbuilders.com for more. December 14th, 1799, our first president, George Washington, passed away. Now, this is the official medical record that was done by the attending physicians who were there at the death of George Washington. In fact, Dr. James Craig, who was one of his very good friends, was the attending physician at his death. And more specifically, Washington's death actually was because Washington was out riding at Mount Vernon. He was out in the middle of a rainstorm. He came home. His clothes were soaking wet, but he was so hungry. He says, you know what? I want to eat dinner before I change. So he ate dinner. Well, the next morning he got up, there's snow all over the ground. He decided, I'm gonna go ride out in the snow. I'm gonna show some of the men here at my plantation the trees I wanna chop down and clear so that the next spring we'll be able to plant there. But he came back that afternoon after he'd been soaking wet the night before, very cold temperature, out in the snow all day, and he just wasn't feeling good. His throat was really, really sore. He started running a fever. Well, back then, if you ran a fever, you would get one of these. This is a medical fleam. And on the end of each one of these is a razor blade. And the razor blades were used actually to intentionally cut yourself to draw blood. And the reason was, if you had a fever, they called it the excitement of the blood. And they thought, well, there's something in your blood that's bad, and so the way to get rid of it is you just need to let some blood out. So you would take this and literally you would cut yourself to intentionally bleed yourself. Well, George Washington knew he was sick. He knew he had a fever. In this, it says, he took from his arm in the night 12 or 14 ounces of blood. Now, the record goes on to indicate that the next morning, he wasn't feeling any better. So they called for the doctor. And here's what the record says. Upon the arrival of the first of the consulting physicians, it was agreed, as there were yet no signs of accumulation in the bronchial vessels of the lungs, to try the result of another bleeding. So he's not feeling any better. Let's take some more blood. Here's what it says. When about 32 ounces of blood were drawn. 32 ounces. He took 12 to 14 the night before. It says 32 ounces of blood were drawn without the smallest apparent alleviation of the disease. So he didn't feel it. I can't imagine why he didn't feel better. We've taken at least a third of his blood out at this point. And he's not feeling it. He probably looked pretty pale at this point. Vapors of vinegar and water were frequently inhaled. 10 grains of calomel were given, succeeded by repeated doses of emetic tartar. Now, modern physicians explain that's essentially like drinking liquid mercury, is how dangerous that was for his body. It says that amounting in all to 5 or 6 grains with no other effect than a copious discharge from the bowels. They gave him diarrhea real bad. So they've taken his blood, they're making him sick. This is not going well for George Washington. The powers of life seem now manifestly yielding to the force of the disease. Blisters were applied to the extremities together with a cataplasm of bran and vinegar to the throat. Now, he was having a hard time breathing and swallowing. And so they were thinking, what can we do? Well, they thought the reason he couldn't breathe or swallow was his throat was swelling up because of the blood. And they said, well, we need to draw the blood away from his throat. So they intentionally applied blister packs to his throat to make his throat blister to try to draw the blood away. Now, this is the worst medical thing I can imagine you doing to our first president, and this is what they're doing. Well, it continues. Speaking, which was painful from the beginning, now became almost impracticable. Respiration grew more and more contracted and imperfect till half after 11 o'clock on Saturday night, when retaining the full possession of his intellect, he expired without a struggle. Well, the doctor says the disease overtook him. I think arguably the doctor overtook him. I think the medical doctors probably killed George Washington. Their names at the bottom, James Craik and Elisha Dick, the two guys who were the physicians at the death of George Washington. In the midst of all that happened to him, it just makes me a little more grateful for our modern advances in medical technology.
My name is Elijah ONeill. I am 20 years old. I'm from Phoenix, Arizona. They should come to this program if they love truth, if they love the idea of upholding principles and the principles that made this nation great. The scripture in Proverbs that talks about he who walks with the wise will become wise, but the companion of fools suffers much harm. And I think about Tim Barton and David Barton on how these men are super wise, and for 2 weeks I've had the chance to walk with them as they show me history using primary source documents. And not only do they have an abundance in knowledge, but they have an abundance in wisdom because they've understood how to apply that knowledge. And being able to come here and learn from them has just been an incredible experience. It's something I'm going to take with me the rest of my life, and it's just made me more valiant and braver to stand up for what I know is right because I know truth. I would tell people to come because truth is worth it. Truth is something that is not easily found in this generation, and it's here. And so if you are a believer in Christ, if you want your faith reaffirmed or strengthened, come here because it will teach you how to be a warrior for Christ.
Dr. Benjamin Rush is a signer of the Declaration of Independence. His friend John Adams said that he was one of the 3 most notable founding fathers. Among his many accomplishments, Benjamin Rush was a great educator. He actually helped start 5 universities. When America became a nation, up to then, education had been handled in every state individually. But now that we're a nation, he started saying, what do we need to be teaching students to make sure that we stay a nation and no longer just 13 states? And so he saw the Bible as being key to helping America stay a nation. In 1790, he actually started writing about education, how that the Bible has to be key to education if America is to remain a unified nation. People responded to what he wrote. And apparently one of those responses came from a man named William Young. He sent Dr. Benjamin Rush a Bible, and he said, I've just done this Bible. This is a great edition of the Bible to be used. And so Dr. Rush writes him back, and I want you to hear what Dr. Rush said about the Bible and how it relates to education. He said, all my hopes of the Reformation and prosperity of our country rest upon the restoration of the general use of the Bible as a school book. For the histories, the doctrines, and the precepts which are contained in it are the only solid foundations for public as well as private happiness. So he saw the Bible as being the foundation of happiness, not only for us individually, but also for us as a nation. About 4 months later, he wrote a piece in which he gave nearly a dozen reasons why the Bible should never be removed from schools. And for generations thereafter, the Bible was a school book in American education.